On April 20th, 2010, a major explosion ripped through the Deepwater Horizon oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico, killing 11 workers, injuring 17 others, and triggering the worst environmental disaster in US history. The disabled oil rig leased by BP, one of the world's largest oil companies, leaked hundreds of thousands of gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico each day until plugged on July 15, 2010. The extensive damage to wildlife surpassed that caused by the US's worst disaster until then, the 1989 Exxon Valdez oil spill. In the days and weeks that followed the Deepwater Horizon explosion, the operational crisis of containing a gigantic oil spill quickly expanded into a communication crisis. BP's initial strategy followed conventional public relations advice, talking about the firm's response to the oil spill, offering sympathy to the families of employees killed in the explosion, pledging BP's support for government probes, and providing updates on the efforts to contain the spill or to stop it. BP supplemented this strategy with a multi-million-dollar advertising campaign featuring apologetic CEO Tony Hayward in a coastal setting proclaiming, "We will get this done, we will make this right." But as the feel-good campaign ran, social media sites were feeding round-the-clock images of the underwater leak. Hayward, who appeared increasingly aloof and disconnected from the realities in the Gulf of Mexico, upset Gulf residents in May 2010 by commenting that the spill was just a tiny drop in a very big ocean. And while apologizing, he added, "There's no one who wants this thing over more than I do. You know, I'd like my life back." The New York Daily News dubbed him the most hated and clueless man in America. The House of Representatives Energy and Commerce Committee noted that there was no evidence executives in charge of exploration in US operations were aware of the problems of the well prior to the explosion. The dust from Hayward's congressional testimony had scarcely settled before the media reported on Hayward's weekend yachting trip, June 19th. The following month, BP announced that Hayward would be replaced as CEO. That an environmental crisis the size and scope of BP's Deepwater Horizon blowout last year became a major public relations crisis should have come as no surprise. At best, this calamity recounts a sad narrative about organizations muddling through. At worst, it represents a scathing indictment of organizational accountability and the moral character of corporate leadership. Public relations crises, such as the one experienced by BP, are inevitably ethical crises. The decision-making behind what to say and to whom, when to say it and in what manner, and via which channels, often leads organizational leaders and public relations counselors through moral quandaries fraught with varying levels of risk, uncertainty, and ambiguity. A crisis, by its very nature, prompts soul-searching among an organization's leaders, other organizational members, and key stakeholders. The aftermath is frequently linked to varying degrees of change in organizational goal setting and planning, operations management, and relationships with the organization's publics. Public relations courses routinely teach students that an impending communication presents recognizable symptoms. In anticipation or in response, corporate communicators can take specific palliative steps in order to mitigate potential damage inflicted upon the trust between the organization and multiple stakeholders. Yet, this is not as easy as it sounds. The point at which an organization slips from a negotiable problem into crisis in many cases seems, unfortunately, poorly defined or perhaps eludes definition altogether. The urgency to apply programmed approaches to public relations problem solving therefore arises from our deep-seated desire to make sense of situations quickly. Public relations responses to a crisis tend to be based on the premise that through communication, the organization in crisis can successfully persuade the various stakeholders that the physical crisis will in time become manageable. Organizations must demonstrate something is being done so people can relax and convince themselves that the threat has been ameliorated. Almost entirely missing from this approach is the admission that communication crisis management is inherently paradoxical. Contemporary wisdom dictates that public relations during a crisis should generate both a satisfactory ethical result, the deontological result, and an optimal rhetorical outcome, the teleological outcome, making the morally right decision and pleasing the largest number of organizational stakeholders by providing an adequate outcome to the crisis. This duality frequently creates double binds for organizational leaders who are called upon to furnish morally sound and comforting responses. Fulfilling one outcome may decouple it from the other. Thus, leaders working in a crisis environment typically provide sense-making in often equivocal communication contexts. They must be prepared to persuasively convey complex organizational phenomena in ways that allow stakeholders to find meaning in ambiguous situations. Crisis response is used to address some very significant rhetorical problems. Organizations must protect stakeholders from harm, help them deal with the crisis, and remove uncertainty created by the crisis. Moreover, the media need to know about what just happened. Implicit in crisis management is the belief that putting into play a communication strategy will, by extension, bring resolution to the crisis itself. In other words, managing the symbolic environment of the crisis will seal off the crisis in the physical world. Persuasive measures usually follow 3 steps. 1, informing stakeholders. 2, adjusting perceptions. And 3, repairing reputation. Informing is the process in which an organization reveals to its stakeholders the measures it will ostensibly take to resolve the crisis, these stakeholders already being aware of what's going on through the media. Adjusting perceptions signifies the process by which an organization attempts to shape public opinion about the crisis, normally through an array of public relations tactics. Repairing reputation refers to an organization's efforts to rebuild its tattered reputation after a crisis, where the term reputation ordinarily means an overall judgment about an organization. Neglected in conventional views of crisis PR is the concept that organizations exist in a communication environment of their own making. According to Carl Weick, one should not consider the organizational environment an objective reality. Rather, organizational members and stakeholders construct this reality from the meanings they themselves derive from their physical and information environments. Depending on their personal experiences and perspectives, different organizational members will imbue a situation with very different meanings. Benjamin Lee Whorf theorized that all observers are not led to this by the same physical evidence to the same picture of the universe. Believing, according to Weick, does control seeing. Seeing, in turn, conditions further beliefs, which in turn constrain seeing, and so on. An organization's image, in one respect, can be thought of as a reality, but not reality itself, even though stakeholders accept the images they construct as reality. Because our perceptions of the universe constitute the explanation for what we consider real, a crisis typically contains much that is unknown and therefore subject to speculation and inference. Public relations, however, generally demands speculation avoidance and consequently maps only a limited amount of information onto the ambiguous and ever-changing crisis. Crisis communication, thus, is often rife with elementalism, which Marty Levinson describes as seeking the cause of something, unconsciously assuming that there is one cause. The danger of binding an evolving crisis into a single way of understanding is that doing so may contrive realities and expectations quite disconnected from the extra-linguistic truth. Also, when a crisis occurs, stakeholders come to see the organization as the crisis. This metonymy, the whole compressed into one, leads stakeholders to view the organization as one solitary thing at one solitary point in time. However, a crisis is not a single thing. Rather, a crisis behaves like a jumble of things, agents, actors, and victims, assembled in both contiguous and non-contiguous ways. Seeing an organization as one thing is a concept based on the useful fiction that although an organization may be made up of many parts, it can speak and act as an individual entity. A notion further augmented, notably here in the United States, by constitutional protections afforded organizations as if they were in fact persons. From this personification, we assume that organizations act in their own self-interest and intentionally in accordance with their own needs and desires, and that's Lance Straight's quote. Neither is a crisis a thing happening in one point of time. Crises seem to unfold, typically preceded by premonitory symptoms that in and of themselves may be unremarkable and therefore easy for members of organizations to ignore. Because people often negotiate their interpretations of the world within what supposedly exists already in that world, sense-making in a crisis runs into difficulty when organizational leaders act as if there is a reality an organization's publics can, in fact, make sense of. Such a realist approach to crisis resolution tends to be algorithmic, rational, sequenced, and repetitive operations that narrowly define our interpretation of what is going on. Constraining interpretation in such a way can debilitate an already fragile communication environment by insisting there are only certain ways to see things, especially if those ways do not adequately account for competing perceptions among stakeholders. A heuristic or constructivist approach, as described by Bob Eddy, or mindful learning, as Sherry Weil calls it, requiring us to entertain a worldview in which we reframe questions and where situations themselves do not arise out of nothing, might be more effectively suited to the management of crisis communication. Leading industry publication PR Week deemed the BP public relations crisis a wake-up call and a fundamental landmark in crisis communication. Indeed, contends the magazine, firms that merely developed crisis plans based on probability scenarios will now be developing those plans with their very organizational survival in mind. Now, will this truly be the case? Or will corporations such as BP continue to navigate crises while relying heavily on a realist approach to their public communication? The preference for realist solutions is well entrenched in organizational life. After all, the bias against mindful learning in crisis communication runs deep, especially when organizations are routinely judged through the lens of public accountability. Organizations feel that they need to keep up appearances and give the impression that its leaders know what they are doing. Organizations remain under pressure to legitimate the image their publics hold in their minds, definitions that stakeholders take to be the accurate organizational reality. Doubts, hesitance, or reevaluation are treated by outsiders as evidence that an organization is unsure of itself, rather than as evidence that it is reflecting, preserving adaptability, or preparing for an even more diverse set of circumstances. And that's White who said that. Stakeholders thus tend to perceive variability as upsetting, and organizational responses to changing circumstances might appear clumsy as leaders do everything possible to justify stakeholders' image of the organization, even as that image becomes increasingly unsustainable. Although not intended as an apology for BP's behavior, it is not hard to imagine that current demands for corporate accountability can, in fact, render organizations less accountable for their behaviors. Despite their best intentions to do the right thing during a crisis, corporate leaders and their public relations advisors need to be alert to the ways their own communication can subvert their ability to make sense of what is happening. Thank you.